December 23, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay buried under a suffocating silence, the kind that only follows a storm. Snow clung to the barrels of Sherman tanks, turning steel into ice. Engines groaned, then died. Men cursed under their breath pluming like smoke in the moonlight. Somewhere along a forest road near Bastogne, a small U.S. tank crew huddled inside their vehicle, trying to coax life from a weapon that refused to move. The cold had turned grease to glue, oil to paste. One by one, American guns fell silent. Across the white fields, German armor crept closer, their engines echoing like distant thunder. Inside Sherman No. 32, a young gunner pressed his gloved hands against the breech, whispering through frozen lips. His crew had already given up. The gun was frozen solid. And then, impossibly, the breech clicked. The barrel lifted. A single round tore through the snow, cutting across the night. It was the only gun that fired when every other jammed. And that single shot would become a moment soldiers would never forget. A story of survival, steel, and the brutal winter that tested every man and every machine. By late December 1944, the Western Front had frozen into chaos. Hitler's armies, once pushed deep into retreat, had erupted with sudden, violent force. In the early hours of December 16th, German panzers smashed through the Ardennes, a dense, snow-choked region the Allies believed impassable. The operation was codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, but it was no defensive stance. It was Hitler's last gamble to split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The offensive began under a cruel ally, the weather itself. A blizzard cloaked the German advance in mist and silence. American reconnaissance planes were grounded. Artillery spotting was nearly impossible. Allied units, thinly stretched, low on supplies, and unprepared for a full-scale winter assault, were scattered across frozen roads and villages that suddenly became battlefields. In the small towns of St. Vith, Malmedy, and Bastogne, the shock was total. Convoys jammed icy roads, fuel froze in lines, rations stiffened into blocks of ice. The Ardennes winter punished both sides, but the Americans, dressed in thin autumn uniforms, suffered worst. Men slept in foxholes filled with slush. Frostbite spread faster than bullets. The temperature often plunged below, 20 degrees Celsius, cold enough to seize a rifle bolt solid in seconds. The cold did more than numb fingers. It turned technology against its masters. Engines wouldn't start without fires lit under them. Breech blocks cracked. Machine guns jammed with the first pull of the trigger. Grease, meant to keep weapons smooth, thickened like tar. Tanks abandoned along the roadsides became monuments of frost and desperation. In the words of one U.S. captain near Houffalize, "We weren't fighting Germans anymore. We were fighting the weather." But the Germans faced their own torment. Their vehicles, heavier and more complex, froze even faster. Panther tanks stalled on slopes. Fuel gummed up in filters. Infantry shivered in thin wool coats designed for autumn marches, not sub-zero nights. Yet in the first days, they advanced. Their advantage lay in surprise and determination, not warmth. Amid this frozen chaos, small pockets of resistance began to form. American crews, cut off from headquarters and low on fuel, dug in wherever they stood. They learned to wrap blankets around guns to keep frost off the mechanisms. Some used ration tins filled with gasoline to warm barrels before dawn. Improvisation became survival. Among them were the armored crews of the 4th Armored Division, racing to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne. Their Shermans crawled through ice-laden forests and snow-filled gullies, engines choking on frozen oil. Many never made it. Others, stranded along the road, became impromptu artillery positions, their crews fighting not from movement, but from endurance. It was during one of these grim nights, somewhere west of Bastogne, that a young gunner's story would emerge. His weapon, an M3 75mm gun, was as frozen as the land itself. Yet somehow, when every other gun jammed, his fired true. The reasons would later be studied and retold in motor pools and briefing rooms alike. But at the time, all anyone saw was the flash of one working cannon in a sea of silence. That single flash became the heartbeat of a frozen battlefield. Proof that even when machines failed, men could still make them fight. The cold had become the enemy's greatest ally. By the third week of December, the front lines were a collage of frozen armor and silent fields. Across the Ardennes, tanks stood like sleeping beasts, coated in frost, their crews huddled inside for warmth. In these conditions, battle discipline took on a new meaning. It was no longer just about tactics, but about mechanical survival. Every morning began with ritual. Crews struck engine blocks with wrenches to crack the ice. They scraped frost from periscopes, lit small fires under fuel tanks, and prayed that engines would turn over. Ammunition belts had to be kept warm under blankets, else the rounds would freeze together. A jammed gun in this weather was as deadly as any enemy ambush. The cold punished the careless and rewarded those who treated their machines with devotion. In the 10th Armored Division, crews began carrying spare cans of low-viscosity oil, a trick learned from mechanics who had once serviced aircraft. The thinner oil stayed fluid longer in freezing air, keeping breech mechanisms from locking up. Others mixed small amounts of gasoline into lubricant. Dangerous, but effective. These were acts of desperation, not procedure. For some, experience became instinct. A gunner named Corporal Thomas H. Ward, later cited in after-action reports near the village of Remoy-Fosse, had learned to disassemble his M3 cannon in near darkness, cleaning each hinge and spring bare-handed. He knew every click, every resistance point. While others cursed their seized weapons, Ward worked methodically, breathing warmth into the gun he called Redfoot, named for the rust stains that ran along its base. His commander, Lieutenant David Kelly, recalled years later, Ward never trusted the cold. He'd clean that gun twice a day, morning and night. Said frost had a way of lying to a man. It wasn't superstition. It was survival. As temperatures fell, weapons turned treacherous. The standard lubricating oils issued by U.S. Ordnance froze solid at 15 degrees C. Bolts welded shut. Recoil mechanisms locked halfway. Entire platoons were rendered useless in moments. A tank without a working main gun became a steel coffin. For every Sherman that advanced, 3 more stood crippled, their tracks frozen into the earth. The Germans faced the same cruelty. Reports from the 2nd Panzer Division noted Panthers immobilized in ditches, their crews forced to abandon them under artillery fire. Machine gun teams wrapped weapons in blankets, hoping body heat would prevent jamming. But every small flame risked revealing their position to American air reconnaissance, should the skies clear. War had slowed to a crawl, not from strategy, but from frostbite and fear. Inside their Sherman, Ward and his crew endured the same misery. Their rations were frozen solid, their canteens blocks of ice. The tank's heater had failed days earlier. Condensation froze on the inner walls. Yet each night, Ward performed the same ritual. Unbolt, wipe, relubricate, and whisper to the frozen barrel as if speaking to a companion. That routine saved them. On the morning of December 23rd, German armor moved through the tree line north of Bastogne. American tanks lined the edge of the forest, engines sputtering to life. And one by one, their guns failed. Frozen breeches, jammed triggers, silence, except for Ward's. His cannon roared, once, twice, then again, steady, alive, unbroken. That burst of sound was more than defiance. It was proof that meticulous discipline could outlast even nature itself. What began as one man's obsession would soon become a turning point. a single working gun firing in a battlefield gone mute. Frost had no mercy for the human body. By the time Ward's crew made contact with the German advance, most of the men were already half numb. Fingers bled through gloves. Eyelashes froze together. To stay awake meant survival. To close one's eyes risked not waking again. In those moments, discipline became a form of courage. Ward wasn't a loud man. His crewmates later described him as quiet, methodical, the kind of soldier who spoke more to his weapon than to people. He trusted what he could control: maintenance, timing, patience. In war, men often pinned their faith on luck. Ward placed his faith in steel. The human angle of this battle wasn't just bravery, it was endurance. Men didn't fight only the enemy, but their own breaking points. In interviews after the war, tank crews spoke of hallucinations from exhaustion, of losing track of days, of praying not for victory, but for warmth. One gunner described the sensation of firing in sub-zero air as shooting inside a vacuum. Even the sound froze. Each man found his ritual. For Ward, it was cleaning. For the loader, Sergeant James Howell, it was rhythm, a beat in his mind that kept him focused, counting seconds between each reload. For their commander, Lieutenant Kelly, it was silence, an instinct to listen to the forest, waiting for the faint grind of German treads beneath the wind. In the Ardennes, small rituals kept sanity alive. But the battle was not only human. It was mechanical, a war of design and preparation. The M4 Sherman, though often criticized for its thin armor, possessed one quality that saved lives in winter: simplicity. Its weapon systems, particularly the M3 75mm gun, could be stripped and serviced faster than any German equivalent. Panthers and Tigers were powerful, but delicate, high-performance beasts that required precision and warmth. The Sherman, crude but reliable, tolerated abuse. In temperatures below freezing, that simplicity became a weapon in itself. Ward's success wasn't luck. It was the result of mechanical foresight. Before the cold set in, he had flushed the recoil cylinder with a thinner lubricant borrowed from an aircraft mechanic. It was a deviation from protocol, technically punishable but effective. While others relied on standard-issue oil that thickened in the frost, Ward's gun stayed flexible. The moment the Germans advanced, the difference was immediate. Across the forest edge, American tanks tried to fire and failed. Breeches cracked like stone. Springs refused to recoil. The sound of engines revving in futility filled the valley. But when Ward's cannon fired, the flash was clean, the recoil perfect. The crew could feel it. That sharp, precise kick that told them the mechanism was alive. Technology had met temperament. A machine built for mass production had survived because one man treated it as an individual. Later studies by U.S. ordnance teams after the battle confirmed what many suspected. Minor adjustments in lubricant type and weapon temperature management could determine life or death in freezing environments. Ward's crew became an informal case study in frontline adaptation. Soldiers improvising solutions that doctrine had overlooked. Yet behind every mechanical victory was a human one. Ward's crew wasn't stronger than the others, just more careful. Their story became an unspoken parable within the division. Keep your gun like Ward, and she'll keep you alive. In the chaos of war, it was rare for soldiers to remember names beyond their own platoon, but in Bastogne's bitter winter, everyone seemed to remember the tank that still fired, and the man who refused to let the cold win. The gun became a symbol, not of power, but of preparation, a reminder that technology alone could not save men who failed to respect it. And as German armor regrouped beyond the tree line, the human and the mechanical were about to merge once more, into one moment that would decide whether the forest held or fell. Across the ridge, the enemy saw it differently. To the German tankers of the 2nd Panzer Division, the forest was not a battlefield, but a graveyard of frozen metal. They had advanced fast, punching through thin American lines, but by December 23rd their momentum was dying. Panthers, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had become sluggish beasts. Their turrets groaned under the weight of ice, their optics fogged with frost. Every time a loader slammed a shell into the chamber, he risked it sticking. From their vantage point, the Americans looked beaten. Smoke curled from disabled Shermans. The snow around them was littered with abandoned rifles. And then, a flash. One bright muzzle flare cut through the mist. It struck the lead Panther square on the glacis, knocking it backward into a ditch. The sound echoed across the valley like a door slamming shut. In German reports recovered after the war, that single cannon was mentioned repeatedly. Crews wrote of one American gun that did not sleep. Another entry, scribbled hastily in the margin of a logbook, read, "The frozen ones still fight." To them, it was inexplicable. Every other Allied gun had fallen silent, but one continued to fire, precise, rhythmic, alive. They assumed it was supported by hidden artillery or an entire battery of tanks. In truth, it was just Ward's crew, refusing to stop. From a tactical standpoint, that isolated Sherman shouldn't have survived. Positioned on the edge of a tree line overlooking an open field, it was an exposed target. The Germans had better armor, longer range, and superior optics. Yet the chaos of the blizzard and the terrain turned those advantages upside down. Fog muffled direction, snow distorted distance. Every flash of light became a false marker. Ward's tank, painted olive drab but now buried under white frost, blended seamlessly into the terrain. The crew used the cold to their advantage, leaving the engine off to avoid infrared detection from the German side. They waited for sound, not sight, firing when the rumble of enemy tracks grew loudest. Each shot was calculated. Ward's gun was no longer just a machine, it was an extension of the man behind it. He aimed through a narrow periscope clouded with condensation, gauging movement by instinct. The loader counted out his rhythm. The commander kept his voice low. There was no shouting, no panic, only the mechanical calm of men who had accepted their fate and refused to surrender quietly. Tactically, their resistance achieved more than heroism. That single functioning gun stalled a local German probe for nearly 30 minutes. It forced the enemy to assume a larger defense lay hidden beyond the trees. In those 30 minutes, the 4th Armored's relief column advanced another mile closer to Bastogne, a small but vital increment in a battle where every hour counted. War often glorifies victory, but rarely endurance. The Battle of the Bulge was not defined by who fired the most shots, but by who refused to stop fighting when reason said to. For the Americans trapped in that forest, the moral calculus was simple: hold or die. Ward's decision to keep firing wasn't driven by orders. Their radio had frozen hours earlier. He fought because stopping meant erasure. The men in that tank had seen what capture meant during this offensive. Massacre at Malmedy, prisoners executed in snow. The cold had stripped war of its grandeur. It had become a raw contest of willpower. In a letter written months later, Lieutenant Kelly described that day in quiet terms. No one cheered when it ended. We just stared at the barrel, steaming in the cold. It looked alive, like it had breathed for us. That sentence captured what statistics could not. Beneath the clatter of steel and fire was something profoundly human. The need to make sense of survival when everything else froze. Ward's gun symbolized more than mechanical endurance. It embodied the moral gravity of perseverance. Historians later debated whether the crew's actions had a measurable impact on the wider battle. Strategically, perhaps not. Symbolically, absolutely. The frozen gun that fired when every other jammed became a quiet legend among the armored corps, a lesson told to recruits for decades. Maintenance is discipline. Discipline is survival. The Germans would eventually retreat, leaving burned vehicles and broken men along those white roads. But in that moment, amid frost, silence, and the endless hum of dying engines, both sides understood the same truth. In war, sometimes victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the last machine that still works. And in that forest, one such machine was still alive, its barrel warm, its crew exhausted, its legend only beginning. The battle erupted just after dawn on December 23, 1944. The forest was ghostly, every branch coated in silver ice, every sound swallowed by fog. Ward's crew sat inside their Sherman, breath visible in the dim light. The tank's walls vibrated with the low hum of the engine they had dared to restart an hour earlier. Outside, the snow began to fall again, slow, heavy flakes that blurred the horizon. Then came the sound they had been waiting for, a low, rolling growl. German armor, closing in. The 2nd Panzer Division was pushing west, desperate to break the American line before Patton's Third Army could reach Bastogne. The lead Panther tanks crept through the mist, their guns swiveling, their commanders peering through frozen optics. Ward's commander, Lieutenant Kelly, raised his binoculars, but the lenses were fogged. He wiped them with his glove and saw movement, the shadowed outlines of armor less than 400 yards away. "Load, AP," he ordered. Sergeant Howell slammed an armor-piercing shell into the breech. Ward's hands trembled from the cold as he aligned the sights. The first German shot came before he could fire. A tracer streaking past, kicking up snow beside them. The air filled with the metallic thunder of cannon fire, though most shells struck trees or vanished into mist. Ward exhaled once and pulled the trigger. The gun responded instantly, smooth, obedient, alive. The recoil slammed through the hull. The shell tore into the nearest Panther's front plate, glancing off but shattering the driver's view slit. Smoke poured from the enemy's hatch. Around them, other American tanks tried to return fire, but nothing happened. Breeches jammed. Recoil cylinders refused to move. The forest fell silent again, except for the rhythmic firing of one gun. Ward's. He fired again. And again. Each shot sent a shock wave through the snow, a heartbeat in the frozen silence. The Germans hesitated. Through their periscopes, they could see muzzle flashes, but not how many. They assumed at least a full platoon of Shermans was dug in along the ridge. They spread out, maneuvering blindly, unsure of where to aim. In reality, Ward's tank was alone, the only functioning machine in a stretch of 2 miles. Then came the return fire. A Panther's 75mm round struck near their right track, throwing snow and soil against the hull. The shock made the crew's ears ring. The loader's hands bled from the cold. The commander's voice cut through the ringing. "Steady. Adjust 2 degrees. Fire!" Ward obeyed. The shot hit home, center mass. Flames burst from the German tank's turret as ammunition cooked off inside. The explosion illuminated the forest for a brief, terrible instant. In the command net, fragments of radio chatter crackled through static. Nearby crews cheering, others shouting for coordinates. No one could see clearly, but everyone heard the one gun still fighting. For those trapped in disabled tanks, that sound became a lifeline. For the Germans, it was confusion. Their reports later described persistent enemy fire from undetermined strength. They paused, regrouped, then launched one more push. But each time they emerged from the fog, Ward's cannon met them. By the time his ammunition racks ran half empty, the snow around their Sherman was cratered and smoking. The gun barrel glowed faintly red, frost melting off it in thin streams. Inside, the crew could barely feel their hands. Howell's fingertips were black with frostbite. Kelly's voice had dropped to a whisper to save strength. But Ward remained steady, breathing in rhythm with the machine he had refused to let die. At 09:47, a direct hit struck their rear fender, rocking the tank sideways. The impact jammed the turret briefly. Ward cursed under his breath, slammed the breech open, and cleared the mechanism. The gun responded again, clunky but alive. He fired one last shell, and then the valley fell quiet. The Germans were gone. What remained was silence, smoke, and the faint ticking of metal cooling under snow. For a moment, Ward didn't move. His hands rested on the gun as if afraid to break the spell. The weapon hissed softly, steam rising like breath from a living creature. Outside, the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting long shadows over the wrecks below. That was the moment the tide shifted, not in the grand strategy of generals, but in the quiet victory of one machine that refused to surrender to the cold. And as reports of that stand spread through the armored division, other crews began to believe that perhaps Bastogne could still hold. By midday, the mist began to lift over the southern shoulder of Bastogne. The battlefield revealed its scars, burned-out Panthers, shattered Shermans, and fields scarred by artillery craters. The 11th Armored Division's forward units had been holding their breath, waiting for another German push. But none came. Instead, the enemy patrols began to withdraw eastward, dragging their damaged tanks with them. In the battalion command post, reports trickled in over frozen radio lines. The lieutenant colonel in charge could hardly believe what he heard. A lone Sherman, cut off near Assenois, had held its position for nearly 4 hours under continuous German assault. Recon confirmed multiple enemy wrecks in front of its position. For a moment, silence filled the tent, followed by a single muttered line from one officer. "Whoever fired that gun saved the flank." Word traveled fast. Tankers across the sector began asking about the frozen Sherman, the one that kept firing when every other gun jammed. Some swore they'd heard the cannon echo through the trees. Others thought it was artillery. But those who'd seen the muzzle flashes firsthand told the truth. One tank, one crew, one miracle of endurance. In reality, there was no miracle. There was just Private Harold Ward, whose stubbornness had kept him cleaning, heating, and relubricating his 76mm gun when everyone else thought it pointless. His wrong grease, the one that didn't freeze, turned out to be an experimental low-temperature mixture borrowed from an air maintenance depot weeks earlier. Ward had begged for a can, reasoning that if it worked for aircraft hydraulics, it might work for tank breaches. It did. When maintenance crews reached his position that afternoon, they found the Sherman covered in frost and powder burns, the barrel still warm. Inside, the crew huddled in silence, faces pale and cracked with cold. The radio operator was half-conscious from exhaustion, the loader's hands wrapped in cloth. But the gun was pristine, gleaming with residue of cordite and oil. They had fired 39 rounds, 21 confirmed hits, 3 enemy tanks destroyed, 2 disabled, and 1 armored car torn apart. In tactical terms, it was a small victory, but in morale, it was seismic. Nearby units that had been retreating began to reform their lines. Infantry companies advanced to retake positions they'd abandoned the day before. The psychological shock on the German side was equally real. Intercepted communications described unexpectedly heavy anti-tank fire and American armor regrouping south of Bastogne. In truth, there was no regrouping, only the illusion created by Ward's Defiance. By nightfall, reinforcements from Patton's Third Army had begun pushing through. The frozen road from Ardennes to Bastogne came alive with headlights and engines. The siege, though far from over, was broken open. Ward's tank was towed back to the service depot, its treads cracked and engine near failure. Mechanics gathered around it like a relic. One sergeant ran his hand along the barrel and shook his head. This one fired when nothing else would. In the command log that night, a short entry appeared under the 11th Armored Division's report. Enemy advance repelled near Assenois. One M4A3 engaged with exceptional effectiveness despite sub-zero temperatures. Crew displayed extraordinary technical discipline. Ward didn't see that note. He was asleep in a makeshift tent, wrapped in blankets, the sound of distant artillery echoing across the forest. His hands were bandaged, his knuckles blistered. When he awoke the next morning, he could barely flex his fingers. Frostbite had set in, but when the medics asked what he wanted first, he simply said, "Check the gun." The weapon had earned a name among the men, the cold shot. It became a symbol, not of luck, but of preparedness. Maintenance crews across the front began experimenting with lighter oils, adjusting cold weather protocols. Commanders cited Ward's actions in briefings as an example of why initiative in the field saves more than orders ever will. Within days, the siege of Bastogne began to crumble under the combined weight of American counterattacks. The 2nd Panzer Division withdrew eastward. The Allies pressed forward again, slowly but steadily, until the Ardennes offensive finally lost momentum. And yet, among all the massive movements of the Bulge, tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, there remained the quiet legacy of one gunner who had refused to yield to the elements. That stand didn't win the battle alone, but it reminded everyone fighting in that frozen hell that victory wasn't about warmth, numbers, or orders. It was about resolve. The snow kept falling, covering the wreckage and the dead alike. The forest grew silent once more, hiding the scars of war beneath white calm. But somewhere beneath that snow lay the faint outline of a Sherman's tracks, and the story of a weapon that refused to freeze when everything else had. When the snow finally stopped falling over Bastogne in late December 1944, the forest resembled a graveyard of machines. Tanks lay half-buried in frost, their tracks split, and guns drooping like broken limbs. Soldiers moved between them in silence, digging out frozen comrades and clearing the wreckage. The battle had left the Ardennes looking less like a victory and more like a test of endurance, one that neither side had truly anticipated. The German offensive, what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, was collapsing. The promise of a final push to split the Allied front had withered beneath logistical failure and bitter cold. Ammunition ran low, fuel froze inside drums. The Wehrmacht, so efficient in summer campaigns, now struggled simply to move. Entire panzer columns stalled for lack of diesel. Their steel beasts turned to statues under ice. For the Americans, survival itself had been a victory. Yet, amid the chaos, stories like Harold Ward's began to circulate through the ranks, retold in foxholes, repair tents, and mess halls. Men who had fought in the same storm spoke of a lone Sherman that refused to fall silent. To some, it was luck. To others, it was proof that discipline, not destiny, determined survival. In the war journals of the 11th Armored Division, the engagement near Assenois was summarized in a few technical sentences. Enemy tanks destroyed under extreme conditions. One M4 crew demonstrated effective maintenance and performance in sub-zero operation. But for those on the ground, it was something more profound. Ward's crew became symbols of resilience. Their story spread beyond Bastogne, reaching higher command. Technical officers from the U.S. Ordnance Department took notice, filing reports on lubrication failure and requesting new cold-resistant formulas for both weapons and engines. Within weeks, supply depots across France began issuing modified oils and antifreeze additives, lessons born from the desperate cold of the Ardennes. Even General George S. Patton, whose army had broken the siege, remarked during a briefing that our machines must be as disciplined as our men. The line circulated among maintenance units, quietly shaping the logistical doctrine that would carry the U.S. Army through the final months of the war. For Ward himself, the recognition came quietly. He was hospitalized for frostbite and exhaustion, his tank reassigned to another crew. A single commendation, the Bronze Star, arrived weeks later, with a brief citation for initiative and technical proficiency under adverse conditions. No parades, no speeches, only a few lines in a letter that began with the words, "For exceptional conduct during enemy engagement." He never spoke much about it afterward. When asked what kept him fighting that night, he reportedly said, "If the gun froze, we were dead. So I kept it warm." That simplicity became the lasting truth of the Ardennes. The war had shifted from grand maneuvers to survival in inches. For the first time since Normandy, Allied dominance had been genuinely tested. The bulge reminded the world that technology could fail, morale could falter, and even the strongest armies could be humbled by weather. But in that frozen wilderness, one man's persistence had turned a malfunction into a message that every battle, no matter how small, could alter the course of larger events. Because while generals debated maps and strategies, it was the mechanics, gunners, and engineers who kept the war machine alive, one working bolt at a time. By early January 1945, the snow began to thaw. The roads filled once more with convoys, trucks hauling ammunition, food, and replacement tanks. The Germans were retreating. The Ardennes front stabilized. But long after the lines moved eastward, soldiers still recalled the bitter winter when the cold became the enemy, and the men who beat it became legends. The guns had fallen silent, but their lessons had only begun to echo. The victory at Bastogne marked more than the turning of a battle. It signaled the transformation of an army. The Battle of the Bulge, though costly and brutal, forced the U.S. military to confront an unexpected adversary, nature itself. In the months that followed, commanders began to acknowledge what frontline soldiers already knew, that mechanical discipline could decide survival as surely as courage. Ordnance. Officers across the European theater compiled reports detailing the failures of U.S. equipment. In freezing temperatures, grease had hardened, recoil systems locked, even radio components fractured from the cold. In response, the Army launched a series of emergency experiments, adapting aviation-grade lubricants for tanks, revising maintenance intervals, and issuing cold start protocols for all armored units. What began as a desperate improvisation in a Belgian forest became standard procedure by February 1945. The effect was immediate. As the Allies advanced toward the Rhine, armored columns rolled more smoothly through frost and slush. Crews reported fewer malfunctions and faster response times. The shadow of Bastogne lingered as a constant reminder. Never again would an American tank fail to fire because of frozen steel. But beyond engineering, the battle had reshaped the human spirit of the Allied ranks. Veterans of the Ardennes spoke of it with a reverence reserved for places like Normandy and Monte Cassino. Bastogne became synonymous not with triumph, but with endurance. The men who fought there had learned to fight not for ground, but for time, to hold the line long enough for reinforcements, to outlast the cold, to prove that resolve could outlive suffering. The German command, too, absorbed its lessons. Hitler's final gamble in the West had consumed irreplaceable resources, thousands of tanks, aircraft, and trained men that could never be recovered. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who oversaw the operation, later admitted that the cold defeated us before the enemy did. His words reflected more than weather. They captured the exhaustion of an army stretched to its limit. For the Allies, the collapse of the Ardennes offensive cleared the path to the Rhine crossings. By March 1945, the Third Army was pushing deep into Germany, its armored spearheads unrelenting. Engineers, remembering the frozen engines of Bastogne, carried portable heaters, antifreeze, and chemical warming packs. Each tank bore small notes painted on their hulls, reminders from mechanics. Keep her warm, she'll keep you alive. In that sense, Ward's story, the gun that fired when every other jammed, had transcended legend. It became doctrine. Technical bulletins circulated across units referencing case studies of effective cold weather maintenance under combat. His actions, though never formally recognized beyond his medal, influenced how field manuals were rewritten for decades after the war. Even in post-war training schools, instructors cited the winter of 1944-45 as the definitive lesson in adaptability. Soldiers learned that victory was not only about strategy or numbers, it was about anticipating failure and refusing to accept it. By the time the snow melted from the Ardennes valleys, spring brought both renewal and reckoning. The Allies were now unstoppable. Yet, amid the celebrations, few forgot the cost. The 80,000 American casualties, the frozen dead recovered weeks later, their rifles still clenched in ungloved hands. The ground itself had become a monument. When Harold Ward returned home to Ohio in late 1945, the war had already faded into newsreels. He went back to a quiet life, working in a machine shop, rarely speaking of that night in the woods. To those who asked, he would only smile and say, "The cold made us equals." Decades later, his cruise Sherman, restored from scrapyard fragments, would find its place in a museum near Bastogne. A small plaque beside it reads, M4A3 Cold Shot. Fired 39 rounds, December 23, 1944. When others froze, it fought. Visitors pass it without knowing the faces behind the name. But for those who stop and look closer, the message endures, that even in the harshest winter of war, steel alone was never enough. It was the will behind it that made history move. And as historians often note, the road to victory in Europe was paved not only with bullets and blood, but with the stubborn refusal to freeze. In the end, the Battle of the Bulge was not remembered for grand victories or decisive maneuvers. It was remembered for the silence, for the nights when engines froze, when guns turned to iron statues, and when men learned that survival depended not on orders, but on instinct. The forests of the Ardennes have long since healed. The snow melts each spring, revealing nothing of the terror that once ruled there. Yet beneath that soil lies the memory of 1,000 small battles, not fought for glory, but for endurance. Each one a reminder that war is not just about weapons. It is about the people who refuse to let them fail. Harold Ward's frozen gun was never meant to be legend. It was simply one man's defiance of the cold, of despair, of inevitability. He didn't fight for medals or recognition. He fought because the alternative was surrender to silence. And that instinct, to act, to adapt, to persist, became the quiet rhythm that carried the Allies through Europe's final bitter winter. Historians often write about tactics, logistics, and command decisions, but behind every statistic is a human choice. A hand that refuses to stop turning a wrench, a soldier who keeps his gun warm in the dark. Those choices, multiplied across thousands, shape the fate of nations. In Bastogne, amidst the frost and thunder, one of those choices belonged to a gunner whose weapon fired when every other jammed. That single act, lost among the roar of war, became proof that courage isn't loud. It's mechanical. It's repetitive. It's the will to keep something working when everything else has stopped. The winter of 1944 taught the world that victory isn't always measured in ground gained, but in ground held. In the moments when men decide to fight the elements as fiercely as the enemy. And when the last gun fell silent, the lesson that remained was simple, timeless, and human. Even when steel freezes, resolve must not.